assume that it's on a lot of people's minds. Now, there is always a challenge that we face when we are reading the Bible. Many people, unfortunately, believe that the Bible has pretty much nothing to teach us in our day. However, there's the other end of the extreme. When people read the Bible, they believe that nearly every aspect of it applies to us in some way. Now, of course, we know from 2 Timothy chapter 3, verses 16 through 17, that all Scripture is inspired and it's given to the servants of God so that we may be complete in every good work. But we must always remember that though the Bible was written for us, it was not written directly to us in every single way. For example, when I read the book of Genesis, I don't feel too inclined to build an ark because I know that message was directed specifically to Noah. When I'm reading the book of Joshua, I don't feel too inclined to walk around the city of Jericho because I know that message was addressed specifically to Joshua and the Israelites. When I'm reading 2 Timothy chapter 4, I don't feel too inclined to go and visit Paul before the winter, bring his books, his parchment, and his favorite cloak, because I know that wasn't directed specifically to me. Now, it doesn't mean that these books are not valuable. Of course they are, and there are still many principles that we can take from these books and apply to our lives today. But we have to remember that they applied to their initial audience in a different way. Now, unfortunately, what many people do when they read the book of Revelation is that they treat it like a modern-day newspaper or a horoscope. They try to find some way in which John predicted the events of our day. And unfortunately, what this often leads to is many people coming up with many different kinds of false doctrines. And it's not just doctrines that are wacky or weird, but some that are actually antithetical to the New Testament. And so what we're going to do to avoid some of these issues, we're going to talk about these particular passages tonight. We're going to talk about what it meant for its initial audience and how we can apply it in our day today. Now, I want to go ahead and make a note before we get too far into the study. As you know, the book of Revelation is a very dense book. We're actually going to be reading a lot of passages, but we're going to be skipping over a lot of information. We don't have time to touch on everything, though we may like to. So before we review the question tonight, what is the mark of the beast? Let's start with just a little background information on the book of Revelation so we have a good foundation to start. One of the first things we want to note about the book of Revelation is that it is written in what scholars today would call apocalyptic literature. Now, the word apocalypse or apocalyptic means to reveal. That is, God is revealing a message to mankind. Although typically when that term is used today, when we're talking about a specific kind of literature, it refers to literature that is very symbolic, very metaphorical, as we know Revelation is. Now, what is the book of Revelation about? Well, if I could boil down this large book into simply two principles, I would say it's about hope and judgment. It is about hope for the Christians who have suffered in this life, and that if they are faithful to the end, they will receive a crown of life. And it is a book of judgment in the sense that for all those who have worked against Christ and his church, whether through false doctrine or through political might, they will receive punishment. Now, let's talk about the audience of this book. If we understand the people whom this book was addressed to, this will help us this will prevent us from running into some of the other issues that people normally run into when they read Revelation. Well, we see from Revelation chapter 1, verse 4, that it was written to the 7 churches of Asia. When we look in chapters 2 and 3, we get a list of their names: Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamum, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, and Laodicea. And interestingly enough, in reference to when this was written, I typically find both liberal and conservative scholars often agree as to its date, somewhere in the last decade of the first century. This may seem like useless information now, but it's all going to become important later. Now, one big question we want to explore before we explore the question tonight is, when we read the book of Revelation, should we assume that it is pertaining events in our day or in the distant future, or events in their day? Well, there's 2 verses I want us to consider. Let's go ahead and look at Revelation chapter 1, and let's begin in verse 1. Notice what John writes. The revelation of Jesus Christ, which God gave to him to show his bondservants the things which must soon take place. Now go ahead and turn to Revelation chapter 22. Revelation chapter 22. And let's go ahead and read verse 10 together. And he said to me, "Do not seal up the words of the prophecy of this book, for the time is near." So we see in both the beginning and end of the book, there is this emphasis that the book of Revelation is about things that are soon to take place, at least from the standpoint of the author John and the people who is receiving this letter. So things that are happening perhaps in the first and maybe even into the second century as well. Now, many people would conclude from Revelation chapter 20, verse 7 to 22, verse 5, that section may be talking about the judgment day, but we can see based off these verses and based off the things we'll read tonight, the book of Revelation primarily deals with things that John and his audience would struggle with. Therefore, when we're reading the book of Revelation, we shouldn't be treating it like a newspaper or a horoscope. It has to do with primarily things that have already happened. Now, to answer the question about what is the mark of the beast, we first have to talk about the beast, or the beast, plural, themselves. So let's turn to Revelation chapter 13, verses 1 through 3. And we'll go ahead and read this together. Now, keep in mind, we're not going to touch on everything in this passage. We're just going to touch on the points that are going to help us figure out who this beast is, so that we can answer the question that was asked. Revelation chapter 13, and let's read verses 1 through 10 together. And the dragon stood on the sand of the seashore. Then I saw a beast coming out of the sea, having 10 horns and 7 heads. And his horns were 10, and on his horns were 10 diadems, and on his heads were blasphemous names. And the beast which I saw was like a leopard, and his feet were those like of a bear, and his mouth were like those of a lion. And the dragon gave him his power and his throne and great authority. I saw one of his heads as if it had been slain, and his fatal wound healed. And the whole earth was amazed and followed after the beast. They worshiped the dragon because he gave his authority to the beast. And they worshiped the beast, saying, "Who is like the beast who is able to wage war with him?" There was given to him a mouth speaking arrogant words and blasphemies, and authority to act for 42 months. And for 42 months it was given to him. And he opened his mouth in blasphemies against God, to blaspheme his name and his tabernacle, that is, those who dwell in heaven. It was also given to him to make war with the saints and to overcome them, and authority over every tribe and people and tongue and nation was given to him. All who dwell on the earth will worship him, everyone whose name has not been written from the foundation of the world in the book of life of the Lamb who has been slain. If anyone has an ear, let him hear. If anyone is destined for captivity, to captivity he goes. If anyone kills with the sword he must be killed. Here is the perseverance and faith of the saints. Now, as I pointed out, there is a lot going on, so we're just going to focus on the elements that will help us determine the identity of this first beast. But the first thing we're actually introduced to is the dragon. Now, who or what is the dragon? Well, thankfully, John is pretty explicit about who he is. As we see in Revelation chapter 20, verse 2, he says that the dragon, the serpent of old, who is the devil and Satan. So he's pretty obvious about that. We can conclude that this dragon is Satan. Now, what does Satan or this dragon seek to do? Well, as we see from the previous context in Revelation chapter 12, verse 17, he wishes to make war with those who keep the testimony of Jesus. Christians, essentially. This dragon, this Satan, wishes to destroy Christians. And so in order to do this, he draws a beast out of the sea. And now, thankfully, the imagery of this beast is not too hard to figure out. If you want to, you can go ahead and briefly turn to Daniel chapter 7. We're only going to touch on a few verses there. Now, throughout the Old Testament, beasts who lived in the sea, or beasts who come from the sea, are often used as a symbolic way of talking about nations, especially nations that war against God. We're not going to look at all of Daniel chapter 7, but if you want to look at more of this imagery, maybe in your own time, you can read Daniel chapter 7, verses 1 through 8. But let's consider some comments about the beast that Daniel sees in verse 24. He says, chapter 7, verse 23. He writes, "Thus he said, the fourth beast will be a fourth kingdom on the earth, which will be different from all the other kingdoms, and will devour the whole earth, and tread on it, and crush it." So we see in the book of Daniel, beasts were seen as kingdoms, or maybe what more we would think of today as an empire. Also, notice what it says about the horns of beast in verse 24. It says, "As for the 10 horns, out of his kingdom 10 kings will arise, and another will arise after them, and he will be different from the previous ones, and will subdue 3 kings." So we also see horns are symbolic of kings, or probably what we would more think of as emperors. So now if you want to, you can turn back to Revelation chapter 13. So we've concluded that beast represents a kingdom or an empire. Its horns represent kings. We also see from chapter 13, verse 2, he is given authority and a throne, likely a reference to political power. We see in verse 7 that he has authority to rule over many nations, people groups, tongues, and tribes. And we see in verse 7 he is also commissioned to persecute Christians. And as we also noted in our introduction, this has to refer to events either in the 1st or the 2nd century. Now, you probably don't have to have a degree in history to figure out who John is talking about. The only nation or empire that would fit any of these descriptions in John's day would be the Roman Empire, and this is what many scholars conclude. It fits all the evidence that we see in these passages. Of course, we could look at more things, but I think that's sufficient there. So we conclude that the first beast is the Roman Empire, and of course its emperors with its horns. Now let's go ahead and talk about the second beast. Let's read verses 11 through 18 together. "Then I saw another beast coming up out of the earth, and he had 2 horns like a lamb, and he spoke as a dragon. He exercises all the authority of the first beast in his presence, and he makes the earth and those who dwell in it to worship the first beast, whose fatal wound was healed. He performs great signs so that even makes fire come down out of heaven to the earth in the presence of men. And he deceives those who dwell on the earth because of the great signs which it was given to him to perform in the presence of the beast, telling those who dwell on the earth to make an image to the beast, who had the wound of the sword and has come to life. And it was given to him to breathe to the image of the beast, so that the image of the beast would even speak and cause as many who do not worship the image of the beast to be killed. And he causes all, the small and the great, the rich and the poor, the free and the slaves, to be given a mark on their right hand or on their forehead. And he provides that no one will be able to buy or sell except the one who has the mark, either the name of the beast or the number of his name. So we see in many ways that this second beast acts as an ally or a servant to the first. And we see from verse 12 that his main job is to cause people to worship the first beast. And from verses 13 through 17, we see that there are several strategies that he implements to make this possible. He uses great signs, he uses economic pressure, and as we see from verse 15, he's even willing to take life to compel people to worship the first beast. Now, we already concluded that the first beast represents Rome and its emperors. Is there any historical evidence that Rome or its emperors were ever worshipped? Well, actually, there's a lot of evidence for this. Beginning with the death of Julius Caesar, emperors were worshipped after their death, and cults were made in their honor. However, by the time of the end of the first century, when John is writing, many of the emperors enjoyed worship while they were still alive. In fact, Domitian, very likely the emperor who was in power when John is writing this epistle, enjoyed being called Lord and God. And there were strict penalties for not worshiping him. And as you can imagine, for the faithful Christians, this would have put them at odds with their political systems. And many of the threats of punishments they would have faced because of it. But is there anything in the Roman Empire that actually would have worked to cause people to worship the emperors that would resemble what we read of in reference to the second beast? Well, there are two potential groups. One, this could be, the second beast could simply be a reference to the local governors of different provinces who forced people to worship the emperor. Although it could have been a very specific institution called the commune or the concilia. And it was set up specifically in Asia Minor. Keep in mind, this is the audience of the book of Revelation. And they were set up specifically to enforce state religion, which would include worship to the emperor. We also have records of early Roman government officials who, when they would suspect a person of not worshiping the emperor, they would interrogate them. And they would allow them to participate in tests to prove their loyalty. They would allow them to offer up incense or wine to the image of the emperor, or they would allow them to curse Christ. And if they heard them curse Christ, they knew they weren't a Christian, and they knew that they were free to go. And as you can imagine, a lot of faithful Christians who wanted to be faithful to the end failed these tests and were punished severely for it. So now that we have an idea of what the first beast is, what the second beast is, let's talk about this mark that is given. Now, I hope I don't disappoint the people who ask this question, because I'm actually going to argue that there probably wasn't a literal mark at all. Keep in mind, much of what we talked about is very symbolic. When John is talking about a dragon and a beast that comes out of the sea, we know that Rome itself isn't actually a giant beast. It actually doesn't have multiple heads. It actually doesn't have horns. These are all symbolic of things that they were facing in their day. This is also true with the second beast. There probably wasn't a second beast that spoke like a dragon and had horns like a lamb. This is all symbolic. It is meant to represent a truth or an experience that they were going through in their society. Consider Revelation chapter 7, verse 3. And if you wanted to, you could also turn to Ezekiel chapter 9, verse 4. You could turn to either of those passages. But we see earlier in the book of Revelation, Revelation chapter 7, verse 3, that those who would follow God were given a mark on their foreheads. Although historically speaking, we find no evidence in the New Testament or within history of Christians ever wearing such a mark. And as we can assume, it is merely symbolic. It is merely a symbolic way of saying this group of people belongs to God. We also see that idea in Ezekiel chapter 9, verse 4. When judgment is coming, God, in a very figurative way, marks the people who belong to him so that they will be protected from judgment. And very likely this is what John is indicating here when he is saying that that these people who serve the beast are given a mark. He's indicating that they belong to the emperor. That is the God whom they worship and serve. And there may be some other overlapping ideas with this idea of a mark. For example, in ancient Rome, we know that there were slaves who would have a brand mark on their hand and on their head, and that indicated that they belonged to their master. We also know that there were some people who were a part of various different kinds of cults who were very passionate about their God. And so what they would do is they would take a brand mark on their hand or on their head, which indicated that they belonged to that particular god. And in a figurative way, perhaps that's actually what John is referencing here, although I'm not sure we have a record of anyone actually getting that brand mark of the emperor on their body. This could just be what he's referencing to. On top of that, we see in Galatians chapter 6, verse 17, that when Paul is writing about his loyalty to Christ, he uses very similar terminology to indicate that he belongs to Jesus. He uses that same slave terminology to indicate that he belongs to him. So that's part of the reason why I think when John is writing of this mark, there's not actually a literal mark being talked about. It is a symbolic way of designating those who belong to the emperor versus those who belong to God. And those who belong the emperor were allowed to participate in the local economy. They wouldn't be killed or persecuted, while those who didn't would suffer. Even though I do think this mark is metaphorical, or I should say symbolic in many ways, we do know that early Christians likely were persecuted in an economic way, as this passage indicates, for their service to Christ. We have evidence that there were certain documents that a person would receive after they worshiped the emperor. And there are many scholars who've suggested that they would have needed those documents to actually participate in the local economy. And if that is the case, if you were a Christian, a faithful Christian, obviously you would not go and worship an image of the emperor. You couldn't get that document, and you could not participate and buy and sell. It's not quite the image, but that is probably what John is alluding to in some way. So let's do a quick review on the question. The question is, what is the mark of the beast? And to get to that conclusion, we concluded that the first beast refers to Rome and its emperors. The second beast refers to the apparatus within Rome that would facilitate the worship to the emperors. And the mark is likely a symbolic way of designating those who belong to God and those who belong to the emperor. And obviously, those who belong to the emperor got to participate in the local economy, while those who belonged to God did not. So let's talk about some practical application to some of the things we talked about today. Now, this, as you can imagine, can be difficult to do, because when most people read the book of Revelation, they always try to find examples where John is predicting events in our day. And there have been many examples of this throughout history, especially in reference to the mark of the beast. Many people throughout the years have thought the mark of the beast refers to bank codes, social security numbers, barcodes. Did I say barcodes? But many things such as that. In fact, the latest thing that some people are talking about is the vaccines that are being sold today. Many people are saying that these vaccines are the mark of the beast. And what they'll say is, there's this state over here, this state over here that doesn't allow you to go to this business, or it doesn't allow you to work this job. In fact, I have a preacher friend in Tennessee, and he has two members who are a little concerned about getting the vaccine, and because they haven't got it yet, their company is threatening to fire them. And so people see examples like this, and they see some superficial similarities with the mark of the beast, and they say, this must be the mark of the beast. The problem with that is, one, it ignores the initial audience in the historical context of this letter. Second, it ignores the purpose of the mark, which was to designate that you belonged to a particular god, in this case, the emperor. So when you explore that idea a little bit further, you see the vaccines really don't fit into that idea. Now, there are some healthy approaches to the book of Revelation in applying our knowledge of it and our own understanding of what God requires of us today. Let me first begin by stating, we do know that the book of Revelation, though it is written in a very symbolic way, does deal with a real time in history, and it dealt with real people and real Christians. And unfortunately, we know that over time, typically, history usually repeats itself in some ways. And unfortunately, many of the things we found, we read and we study of the Roman Empire repeated itself in some way in the 20th century. Consider the Japanese Emperor Hirohito in World War II. In many ways, he was treated like the Roman emperor was. Let me read you a few quotes that I found concerning him. During the 1930s, there were some who taught that the emperor was the Akitsu Mikami, that is the manifest God, a human being in which the property of God nature was perfectly revealed. However, the emperor's qualities of kami nature, together with his direct descendant of one of their great gods, made him superior, so superior that the Japanese thought it entirely logical that they should obey the emperor and worship him. And we can see how that mindset, along with many other bad ideas they had, led to a lot of the atrocities that we read about in the East in the 20th century. This is also true with what we know of Mao Zedong. Now, of course, he was the communist leader of China in the mid-20th century. And his image and his face was plastered all over China, typically being depicted as a benevolent father. And many people even had shrines to him in their home. I was listening to an interview from a lady who lived under his regime a long time ago, clearly. And she said, in many ways, I thought of him like a god, and I was so surprised when he died. And we can see how that cult of personality, that influence, allowed so many different atrocities to take place. And that's cool. That's true with many other figures in the 20th century. Even men like Stalin and Hitler, who weren't necessarily depicted or thought of as a god. There was a cult of personality built around them. And because of their influence, they were allowed to get away with many terrible things. Now, of course, we know our current situation is different in many different ways. Although, unfortunately, we still can find some application in our day today. I know many people are passionate about their politics and their political ideas, but I've seen some Christians take their affiliation to their political party or to a particular candidate more seriously than the cause of Christ. And, even though our situation is very different than our spiritual ancestors, their dilemma was, do I make my emperor my Lord, or do I make Jesus my Lord? And unfortunately today, many people choose to make some political figure or some party their Lord over Jesus. And I hope that we as Christians today choose Jesus as our Lord over everything else. And if we do so, we will inherit all things. Now, I'm going to go ahead and offer the invitation, but after that, I'm going to read a passage, and then it'll go back over to Mylan. If there's anyone here tonight who is ready to make Jesus their Lord, because you believe that he is the Son of God, and you're willing to repent of your sins and put him on in baptism, we can help you with that right now. But if you're here tonight and you were once loyal to Christ, but you're no longer living in a way that is well-pleasing to him, we'd love to pray for you. We know God will forgive you. If there's anything we can do to help you in any spiritual way, please let us know and come forward. But before we conclude, I want to read one passage from the book of Revelation, Revelation chapter 20. If you'll turn with me there, and we'll start in verse 14. Part of the reason I want to read this passage is because, keep in mind, this passage was addressed to early Christians. And this passage was a reminder of the reward that they would receive if they were loyal to the very end. And that's true for us today. If we are loyal to the end and we make Jesus the Lord of our life in every way, this is what we can hope to receive as well. So let's begin in Revelation chapter 20, and we'll start in verse 14. Then death and Hades were thrown into the lake of fire. This is the second death, the lake of fire. And if anyone's name was not written in the book of life, he was thrown into the lake of fire. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth. For the first heaven and the first earth passed away. There was no longer any sea. And I saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, made ready as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, Behold, the tabernacle of God is among men, and he will dwell among them. And they shall be his people, and God himself will be among them. And he will wipe away every tear from their eyes. And there will no longer be any death. There will no longer be any mourning or crying or pain. The first things have passed away. And he who sits on the throne said, Behold, I am making all things new. And he said, Write, for these words are faithful and true. And then he said to me, It is done. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. I will give to the one who thirsts from the spring of water of life without cost. He who overcomes will inherit these things, and I will be his God, and he will be my son.